Up next on the symposium stage, Detecting Legacy Red Flags for De-SPAC and Rev Mergers, with Jeff Neumeister, partner at Neumeister & Associates, starting now on the symposium stage.
Awesome, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm sure some of you are ready for lunch. Give a little bit of background on myself, right? So I'm a forensic accountant of about 2.5 decades. So much of my background has been investigating from an accounting perspective. And I think of it's one of the questions is like, what exactly is a forensic accountant? I think of it's like CSI, but instead of bodies and blood, it's documents and numbers. Right? Otherwise, conceptually very similar. Right? So would be involved in identifying inconsistencies, involved in due diligence, involved in litigation, pre-litigation, and I do a decent amount of expert witnessing. So because of my background, I've been pulled into a lot of outsourced CFO roles to try and clean things up, clean house, due diligence projects, both on the buy and sell side, right? And identifying inefficiencies, internal control issues, and what have you. And so that's where kind of the identifying red flags comes into play here. So in the context for this session, it's on the De-SPAC front. Right? For those not so familiar with that process, you have a special purpose acquisition company that goes IPO it's essentially a shell entity for the express purpose of acquiring a target entity. In those situations, there's inherently less to go on the IPO front, right? It's a shell. How much auditing is there to do, right, by the SEC or any other regulatory body? There's not much there. So one of the attractive aspects of going that route is the IPO process is going to be a little bit more straightforward. Yes, there's still concerns about disclosures and all those things still need to happen, but it's a way for certain target companies to possibly go IPO route with maybe a little bit less scrutiny. Okay? And so that opens the door up to potential issues. Right? One being that there's a little less scrutiny happening, right? Then there's a higher opportunity for financial statement fraud and other misbehaviors. There's also now the added pressure for the SPAC to close on an acquisition, generally 2-year timeline. Sometimes you get a special extension. Right? So with that deadline looming, there could be pressure to close on a target entity without doing the full degree of due diligence that you normally would do from a buyer perspective. I'll give you a couple of war stories, examples. One of them was, I had a couple of clients. They are passive investors. These gentlemen, both ultra high net worth, they would essentially front the money on various operating entities. And they'd identify an operator to run point on the business for them, right? Then they're hands off. One of their businesses, the one that they brought us in on, was in the franchise world. They identified an operator. They put up the cash of about 90% was out of their pockets. The operator got a little shy of 10% just to incentivize him to make sure the businesses are profitable. And the idea was down the road to potentially be a target for a SPAC. After a few years, about 4.5 years, these passive investors, being very passive in their operations, they have a lot of businesses this way, by the way. All right, so they'd put in the money, bring in an operator, and then they just kind of be hands off, wait for their K-1s, and have their CPA file their returns for them. Over the course of this 4.5 year period, they never received monthly packages. They never received audited financials. They never received anything other than a K-1 during extension season. Right? They didn't really think anything of it because their idea was they have this operator that's handling everything for them, so they don't have to think about it. Right? But it became a little suspicious after 4.5 years that it didn't seem like that they were making that much compared to some of the other investments, right? Where they do kind of the same thing. They'll put in, 50 million or whatever it is, and then have an operator kind of run point on them. And usually after a couple of years, they would expect, rightfully so, to have a little bit more of a meaningful ROI. So they brought us in to start, maybe checking under the hood a little bit, especially if they wanted to be a potential target for a SPAC in the coming years. Right? They wanted to make sure that they're ready to pull the trigger on that. So we start looking at the records they have, which were essentially non-existent. They put us in touch with their operator. We'll call him Paul, because his name was Paul. And we asked Paul, please provide us copies of the general ledgers, any sales reports, pretty much anything and everything you have. All the customary business documentation that any operating business should have at their fingertips, including tax work papers, notices, returns. And days went by, nothing. We follow up again. We finally got access to a set of books, and then it came with a caveat. Oh, by the way, that's just one of the general ledgers. So right out of the gate, we uncovered that there's more than one sets of books. Huge red flag. Why are there two sets of books? Paul's explanation is that they had a payroll provider use one general ledger for payroll and certain accounts payable, and another general ledger maintained by their CPA for the rest of the stuff. And then they purportedly just journal entry these things from the payroll ledger. Problem is that no one was doing any sort of reconciliation. Right? So that was one red flag we brought up with the owners. Right? That's highly unusual. It's not a best practice. It's very messy. It opens up the door for human error as well as intentional omission or adjustments. We continued this process with Paul. Days would go by, weeks would go by. We asked for documents that should be readily available, and he would trickle them in. Maybe a document here or there, maybe something uploaded on the weekend. And it got to a point where we just went back to the owners, like, there's a problem here. There's a big problem here. If we ask for documentation that should be maintained in real time, and it's taking days, weeks to get to us, and even then it's just piecemeal information, something's wrong, something is amiss. Right? So they approached Paul, said, look, you need to provide our consultants, our accountants, everything that they ask for. Just be transparent with them. Right? What's the issue? Why are you not providing things? Filed a tax return, you should have a copy of that saved on your system, your server, even his local laptop. The next day, he gave his notice. Surprise, surprise. And he wrote, it was about like a 5.5-page resignation letter saying he did everything he could to make sure this business was successful. He put in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of his own money in the early years to make sure it had proper cash flows, that he can't work under this kind of harassment. All the kind of finger-pointing defensive mechanisms that are very, very common with this kind of stuff. Right? So they agreed to continue working with him. I advised them that it could be tempting to just let him go, but usually the second you fire a potential fraudster, they're not going to work with you anymore. At least he's still kind of in the mix, that we could try to extract as much knowledge and information from him and documents before he departs at the end of the year. He gave about a 3-month notice. This is last fall. Right. They continued to work with him. We found that some of the things that he was doing, it wasn't necessarily he's being malicious or intentionally just engaging in outright fraud or embezzlement, but he was just outside his realm of comfort. He didn't know what he was doing. Here's an operator that was tasked with overseeing the entire operations of this multi-franchise business, and he didn't know how to oversee the accounting, finance, and tax compliance issues. He was relying heavily on a couple of outside bookkeepers and the CPA firm, who are also outside their depths. So there's just a lot of things that fell through the cracks. We did find that there were some egregious charges on his part. He was using his personal credit card to purchase anything and everything for the business, as well as some stuff that's definitely more personal. And then he'd have the business pay his credit card bill every single month, $30,000, $40,000 every single month, to rack up the points, right? So the takeaway to the business owners is that, look, he's definitely running probably a couple $100,000 a year of personal stuff. It's not a deduction, right? He's over benefiting. But he's also accruing vast amounts of points on the credit card that really belong to the business. As of now, I believe he's gone, and now they're working with our accounting and tax teams to kind of get things back in order, right? To consolidate to a single general ledger and do all these other just best practice things that should have been happening since the beginning. I'll give another example. We had is also pre-De-SPAC. They were in discussions. This company was in the pool industry. The founder built this company from scratch to, I think, is like a $50 to $80 million business, and they were in talks with actually a couple SPACs. And before they got too far into those discussions, he had some issues with his CEO. Mainly when, same thing, asking for documentation for us, or for that he was anticipating his attorneys and the other side, the buyer, would be asking for. And his CEO just always had excuses, was always too busy, was always out of the mix, or say he didn't have it. He would push things onto others, the outside CPAs and whatnot. We come to find out that this CEO, the real red flag there is actually how he became the CEO of this business. Right? So the founder, this older gentleman, started the business from scratch. His daughter was his CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, and he would periodically visit some of his locations that were nationwide and speak with the sales managers and staff, just kind of have his finger on the pulse of what's going on in the culture of his company, right, in all their locations, to make sure that there's some consistency in how things are being done. And he met this sales manager at one of the locations and was swayed by this individual. He was a go-getter. He had great sales numbers, and they really, really just kind of connected, right, and almost kind of like a mentor-mentee sort of perspective. And he brought the sales manager to their headquarters to put him on an executive track. And pretty soon after, he made him CEO. And his daughter also vouched for the guy. Right? His daughter thought he was the next best thing since sliced bread. Said, like, oh, he's the perfect heir apparent for you, Dad. Right? And we didn't find out till later on the reason why daughter vouched for the sales manager and thought he was like definitely the heir apparent for her father was because they had an affair, right? There's something going on there. So anyways, the father made this guy his CEO. So the father kind of take a huge step back, more of just kind of a board role. Again, he wanted to kind of retire, especially after being acquired, and that was his plan. Within a few years, be acquired by one of these SPACs, and then he could kind of walks away knowing that his daughter and this gentleman are kind of running the show. The person that he brought in as the CEO, this guy, from early on, one of the things he started doing is a lot of self-dealing. He started engaging in memorandums of understanding. The thing of kind of like watered down contracts. The interesting thing was he's signing on behalf of himself and companies that he owned, that he created, and this pool enterprise. So he had engaged in things, for example, deferral of compensation, deferral of his salary as CEO, and in exchange of that, he's going to take stock in the pool company. So what happened was by the time everything was said and done, and we realized what he was doing, right, and realized that we needed to get him out of the equation so that they can actually continue potential discussions with some SPACs, that this gentleman's position was, well, no, you can't fire me. I own the entire company. I own 100%. Here's the stock certificates. Well, how did that happen? Well, I have all these memorandums of understanding, right? I deferred my compensation and other things and services that provided by some of my other consulting companies in exchange for stock in the business, right? So his position, his attorney's position, was that he owned the entire company, and you can't sue him, right? Because then he's suing himself. Obviously, that didn't fly. Eventually, we were able to kind of get him out of the picture and get him to settle. And I think that eventually the law enforcement took that case over after the civil component. So some of the takeaways with red flags, and this applies for the De-SPAC process. This applies for startups. This applies for mid-market. Any enterprise, really, is getting documents in a timely fashion. Right? If you ask for something in due diligence or pre-due diligence, and for some reason it takes a long time to provide something that should just be a few clicks away, there's a problem there. There's a problem there without even reviewing the documentation. Right? I think that's it on time. I think we have a few moments now for Q&A. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll be in the back.